My hands were still cold when I walked into the restaurant. It was February in Calgary, and I had driven 40 minutes through a snowstorm to be there. I almost turned back twice. I should have trusted that instinct. My aunt had called me 3 days earlier. She said the family was gathering for my parents' 35th wedding anniversary dinner. She said it would mean a lot if I came. She said my mother had been asking about me. I want you to sit with that for a moment. My mother had been asking about me. I hadn't spoken to my mother in 8 months. I stood in the entrance of the restaurant, still in my coat, scanning the long table near the back window. I could see my father at the head of it. I could see my older brother Marcus sitting to his right, laughing at something. I could see my aunt, who had called me, already looking down at her phone. And I could see the empty chair that had been left not at the table exactly, but slightly apart from it, near the end, close to the wall. Like an afterthought, like a chair they had added at the last minute because someone reminded them I existed. I walked toward them anyway. My father saw me first. He didn't smile. He looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture that's been moved to the wrong room, not anger exactly, just a kind of mild, tired confusion about why it was there. My mother turned when she heard my footsteps. She said, "Oh, you came." Not warmly, just observationally, the way you'd say the mail arrived. I said yes. I said I wouldn't stay long, I just wanted to see them. My father said, "Sit down then," and pointed at the chair near the wall. I sat down. I need to tell you something about my family before I go further, because otherwise none of what comes next will make sense. I am the middle child. My older brother Marcus is a civil engineer. He works for a firm in downtown Calgary, makes very good money, and has a wife named Diane who brings homemade butter tarts to every family gathering. My younger sister Noelle is a dental hygienist. She finished her program at SAIT, moved back into my parents' neighborhood in Airdrie, and sees them every Sunday for dinner. And then there is me. When I was 19, I told my parents I wanted to become a paramedic. My father looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "That's not a career. That's something you do until you figure out what you actually want to do." I said I had already figured it out. He said, "Paramedics make $40,000 a year. You want to spend your life driving an ambulance?" I said I wanted to spend my life helping people who were dying. He didn't have a response for that. He just picked up his coffee and left the kitchen. My mother was more measured about it. She said she just wanted me to be realistic. She said I should think about job security. She asked if I'd considered nursing instead. "At least nurses work in hospitals," she said. "At least they're indoors." I enrolled in the primary care paramedic program at SAIT the following September. I told them at Thanksgiving. My father said, "Well, it's your life." He said it the way people say things they don't mean. I graduated 2 years later. I passed my provincial licensing exam on the first attempt. I got hired by Alberta Health Services before I even had the certificate framed. I called home to tell them. My mother said, "That's good, honey." My father asked if I was still planning to go back to school for something else eventually. I said no. I said this was what I was doing. He said okay. That was 6 years ago. In those 6 years, a few things happened. I became an advanced care paramedic. That meant 2 more years of training, a harder licensing exam, expanded scope of practice. I could administer a wider range of medications, perform more complex interventions, work in more critical situations. It wasn't a small thing. It was a significant credential. My supervisor at the time told me I was one of the strongest candidates he'd seen come through the program in years. I called home to tell them. My mother said, "That sounds good." She asked if I was eating properly. I also joined the STARS Air Ambulance program. STARS Shock Trauma Air Rescue Service operates helicopters across Alberta and into Saskatchewan and Manitoba. We respond to the most critical calls, the ones where ground transport isn't fast enough, the ones where minutes genuinely decide outcomes. I had applied twice before being accepted. The selection process is rigorous. Not everyone gets in. I did not tell my family about STARS. By then, I had learned that telling them things only created opportunities for them to say something that would stay with me for months. What I did instead was work. I worked long shifts, night shifts, winter shifts in conditions that would genuinely surprise you if you haven't done it. I worked a Christmas Eve where we landed a helicopter in a field outside Drumheller because that was the closest flat surface. I worked a shift where I spent 47 minutes keeping a man alive long enough for the surgical team at Foothills Medical Centre to take over. And he lived, and I cried in my car on the drive home and then went back the next day. I did not talk about any of this at family dinners. On the rare occasions I attended family dinners, I talked about the weather and whether the Flames were having a decent season. My father talked about Marcus's firm landing a new contract. My mother talked about Noelle's upcoming vacation to Cancun. My aunt asked if I was seeing anyone. I was, briefly, but that's a different story. By the time of the anniversary dinner, I had been with Stars for 3 years. I was a flight paramedic. My call sign, which is the kind of thing that is not publicly advertised but is also not a secret, was known to every dispatch center in the province. I had been involved in more than 400 air medical responses. I had been asked twice to provide input for protocol reviews at the provincial level. None of my family knew any of this. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't some quiet plan to wait for the right moment. It was simpler and sadder than that. I had stopped expecting them to care. Every time I had shared something, a certification, a commendation, a difficult call that had gone well, the response had been so flat, so absent of anything resembling recognition, that eventually I just stopped reaching for it. It's not dramatic, the way you learn to stop wanting something. It just gradually hurts less to not want it than to want it and be disappointed. So I kept my work life separate. I came home for Christmas sometimes. I answered my mother's calls when I wasn't on shift. I showed up for the anniversary dinner because my aunt asked me to, and because some part of me, the part that apparently hadn't learned yet, thought maybe this time would be different. The dinner started the way all dinners in my family started. My father ordered for the table without consulting anyone. He chose the salmon for my mother, who has not eaten salmon since 2019 but who said nothing. He talked about a property dispute with a neighbor that had apparently been ongoing since August and was unresolved, and Marcus offered opinions, and Diane offered sympathy, and Noelle scrolled her phone under the edge of the table. I ate my soup and watched the snow accumulate on the window ledge outside. About 40 minutes in, my father said, "So, are you still doing the ambulance thing?" I said yes. He said, "And you're still just with the city?" I said I worked for Alberta Health Services. I had worked for AHS for 6 years. This was not new information, but he asked some version of it every time I saw him, as though my career were a temporary situation that might have resolved itself since we last spoke. I said, "Actually, I've been with the air ambulance program for a few years now." He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "STARS, the helicopter service, critical care transport." He looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at his plate. My father said, "So you're still just a paramedic?" That's the word he used. Just, I said yes. I'm a paramedic. He nodded slowly, the way he did when he was making clear he was exercising patience with me. My mother said, "We just worry, you know. It doesn't seem stable. You're not getting younger." I was 31 years old. Noelle looked up from her phone for the first time since the bread had arrived. She said, "Marcus and Diane have some news, actually," which I understood immediately as an act of mercy. She was trying to redirect the table. Whatever Marcus's news was, I was grateful for it. Marcus said, "We've been approved for a mortgage. Diane and I. We're buying in Springbank." My father's whole face changed. He leaned forward. He said, "Springbank? That's a good area. What are you looking at square footage-wise?" And just like that, I was gone from the conversation. I went back to my soup. What happened next, I have thought about many times since. I have turned it over from different angles and tried to understand all the pieces of it. I'm still not sure I fully do. About 20 minutes after Marcus's announcement, the restaurant door opened and brought in a rush of cold air and 2 people I recognized. One of them was Dr. Patricia Osei, the trauma medical director at Foothills. She was with a man I didn't know, her husband, I assumed. They were being seated across the room. I didn't think much of it. Calgary's medical community is not enormous. I had worked with Dr. Osei on dozens of calls. She is one of the most respected trauma physicians in the province. I liked her. She was direct and competent and had never once made me feel that my role on a scene was secondary to hers. She spotted me about 5 minutes after they sat down. She got up and walked across the restaurant. She said, "Claire, I thought that was you." I stood up. We shook hands, and then she surprised me by doing something she'd never done in a clinical setting. She pulled me into a brief hug. She said, "I'm so glad I ran into you. I've been meaning to reach out." I said, "What's going on?" She said, "You heard about the protocol review submission? The one that went to the college?" I said, "Yes." She said, "They approved it. The expanded airway protocol, your input, was a significant part of why it went through." She said, "I want you to know that. I told the committee lead it was your work as much as anyone's." I said I didn't know it had been approved. I said, "That's really good to hear." She squeezed my arm. She said, "You've built something remarkable over the last few years. I mean that." She looked at me for a moment in the way that people sometimes do when they're trying to make sure the words land. She said, "The team talks about you, you know. Your read on a scene is," she paused and smiled. "I tell my residents that if they can develop half the clinical instinct you have, they'll be excellent doctors." I didn't know what to say. I think I said, "Thank you." She said, "I'll let you get back to your family. We should have coffee soon, properly." She walked back to her table. I sat back down. The table was completely silent. My father was looking at me. Not the tired, flat look from earlier. A different one. Something I couldn't immediately name. He said, "Who was that?" I said, "Dr. Patricia Osei. She's the trauma medical director at Foothills." He said, "And she knows you." It wasn't really a question, but I said yes. He said, "What was she talking about?" "The protocol, the college." I said, "The College of Paramedics. There was a review of advanced airway management protocols for air medical transport. I contributed to the clinical input." He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I helped write part of the clinical guidance that paramedics in the province will now follow when managing airways in critical patients during helicopter transport." Silence. My mother said, "I didn't know you did things like that." I said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at her for a moment. I thought about all the times I had tried to tell them things. I thought about just a paramedic. I thought about the empty chair near the wall. I said, "I didn't think it would matter to you." My father's jaw tightened. He said, "Of course it matters. We're your family." I said, "You asked me 40 minutes ago if I was still just doing the ambulance thing." He opened his mouth and closed it. Marcus was looking at the table. Diane was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, not unkind, maybe something closer to pained. My aunt, who had said nothing for most of the dinner, said quietly, "Claire." I said, "I'm not trying to make a scene. I answered your question honestly, Dad. I'm a paramedic. I've been a paramedic. I've been doing this for 6 years and I've worked hard at it and I'm good at it. I don't need you to think it's impressive, but I would have appreciated, at some point, you asking me about it like it was a real thing." My father said, "We do think it's a real thing." I said, "You called it the ambulance thing tonight. Last Christmas you asked Marcus what he thought I should do instead. I was in the room." He said, "That's not I was just trying to." I said, I know what you were trying to do." I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. I said, "I'm happy for you both. 35 years is something real. I mean that. I just think I should probably go." My mother said, "Claire, don't." I said, "I'm okay, Mom. I'm not upset. I just have an early shift." I didn't have an early shift, but I thought it was kinder than the truth. I drove home in the snow. I put on the radio some late-night talk show, voices I didn't recognize, and I drove and I let the highway disappear under the headlights, and I didn't think about anything in particular. There is a kind of empty calm that comes after family dinners sometimes. Not peace exactly. Just the absence of having to perform. My phone buzzed twice while I was driving. I didn't look at it. When I got home, I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table, which is small and faces the window, and I looked at the snow coming down over the parking lot, and I thought about what Dr. Osei had said. "You've built something remarkable." I thought about how strange it was that a near stranger, a colleague I had worked alongside in the back of a helicopter and on highway shoulders, and in the freezing dark of rural Alberta, a person who had never once been asked to love me saw more of what I'd built than the people who had known me my whole life. I thought about the question I'd heard people ask when stories like mine get told. The version that had been sitting in the back of my mind all evening. What if I hadn't been a flight paramedic? What if I had been exactly what my father thought I was, someone drifting, someone who hadn't figured it out, Someone who'd made the wrong choice at 19 and never recovered from it. Would I have deserved to be at that table? I don't think the answer to that question is complicated. I think the answer is yes. I think the answer is that a daughter who is struggling deserves her parents' table just as much as a daughter who has been cited in a provincial protocol review. I think the version of me who never made it past her first licensing exam would still have been worth knowing, but I am not sure my father agrees. And that is the part I have not found a way to stop thinking about. My father called me 2 days later. I almost didn't answer. It was a Sunday morning, and I was on my second coffee, and I had been reading, which is something I don't do enough of, and I looked at his name on my screen for 4 full rings before I picked up. He said, "I've been thinking about the other night." I said, "Okay." He said, "I didn't know. About the work you were doing. I didn't know the extent of it." I said, "I know you didn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother looked it up. The STARS program. And the college submission thing. She found some of that too." I didn't say anything. He said, "I didn't realize how serious it was. The work." I said, "It was always serious, Dad, even when it was just the ambulance thing." He was quiet again, longer this time. He said, "I owe you an apology for that. I hadn't expected him to say it. I want to be honest about that. I had not expected him to say it, and the unexpectedness of it knocked something loose in me that I had to work to hold still." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I should have asked more. I think I didn't understand it, and instead of asking, I just assumed." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm sorry, Claire." I believed him. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I believed that he meant it. And I also knew that meaning it didn't undo the years of ambulance thing. The years of the chair near the wall. Both things were true at the same time, and I was tired enough and honest enough to hold both of them. I said, "I know. I accept that." He said, "Can we? Your mother and I would like to have you over." "Just dinner. At the house. No occasion." I said I'd check my schedule. I said it genuinely, not coldly. I would check my schedule. I might go. I hadn't decided yet. Here is what I want to say, if you've listened this far. I am not telling this story because my father was wrong about paramedics as a career and I turned out to be impressive. That's not the story. If I had spent the last 6 years doing exactly what he feared, struggling with the work, questioning my choice, never advancing, never finding solid ground, I would still have deserved a father who asked me real questions. I would still have deserved a chair at the table that wasn't near the wall. The measure of whether a person belongs at the family table should not be their professional credentials. It should not be their salary or their title, or whether a trauma physician stops to hug them at a restaurant in February. I know that. And I think you know that. What I'm still working out is what to do with a family who needed a trauma physician to remind them I existed. Not out of cruelty, I don't think my father is a cruel man, but out of something quieter and in some ways harder to name, a failure of attention, a habit of measuring that nobody decided to have, and nobody decided to stop. I drove back to Calgary the following weekend. I parked in my parents' driveway and I went inside and my mother had made chicken soup, which is what she makes when she doesn't know what else to offer. My father sat across from me and asked me, genuinely, about the STARS program. He asked how we trained for winter operations. He asked what the hardest part of the job was. I told him. I told him more than I had told him in 6 years. He listened. Not perfectly. He interrupted twice. He made one comment about job security that I let go. But he listened. My mother refilled my bowl without being asked. It was not a transformation. It was not a resolution. It was just a Sunday in February in a kitchen in Airdrie, and the snow was coming down, and my father was asking me questions he should have asked years ago, and I was answering them. That's the most honest ending I have. It wasn't everything, but it wasn't nothing either. And some nights, when the shift is long and the sky over the foothills is very dark, and the helicopter is descending toward some lit-up intersection somewhere between here and the mountains, I think about that kitchen, and I think that maybe nothing, slowly, over time, if both people keep trying, can become something after all. I'm not sure yet, but I'm still trying, and I think that counts.